Dear Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your invitation to EVision and welcome in Brussels. It's a pleasure to be part of this very interesting event, even if I couldn't be physically with you today. As Minister of Mobility from a densely populated country with notorious traffic jams and poor air quality, one of my main tasks is, of course, to improve the daily mobility of our citizens. But I must also propose solutions to deal with the climate crisis, which is getting worse every year, and help reduce the environmental impact of the transport sector, which is the only one whose greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow. All European and national efforts over the past 2 decades have so far been in vain. According to a recent report by the European Court of Auditors, EU car emission standards have not led to the desired reduction in CO2 emissions from newly registered vehicles. A decade after the first CO2 regulation entered into force, CO2 emissions from new passenger cars only began to drop significantly in 2020, but this was mainly due to the uptake of electric vehicles, while real CO2 emissions from diesel and petrol cars did not drop. Electric cars are therefore one of the tools we have for a real decarbonization of transport. The recent figures in your joint study are promising. 13% of all cars sold in 2022 were electric in the EU. There are now 8 million EVs in Europe. But because we also have huge challenges regarding energy supply and grid connection, we need to think about our grid as well and its interaction with cars. In November last year, I had the pleasure to attend the first conference on vehicle-to-grid technology in Berlin. That technology allows bi-directional charging of electric vehicles and can help balance the supply and demand of electricity on the network, as a car spends more than 90% of its time stationary and could be used as a power reserve for the grid. There already exist standards favoring the development of technologies allowing bi-directional charging, but the integration of such innovation is not yet binding for manufacturers. There is therefore a European mandatory framework to be developed, and this will need further work, including on the adaptation of the grid. This leads me to what the public authorities can do for the uptake of electric cars in Europe. At the European level, many initiatives have already been taken. From 2035 on, the ban on the sale of new internal combustion engines will come into force. The alternative fuels infrastructure regulation has been adopted and sets binding targets for the deployment of charging infrastructure. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive includes provisions for EV charging in buildings and the right to plug. The Renewable Energy Directive requires 32% of energy consumed in Europe by 2030 to be renewable. CO2 emission performance standards set mandatory reduction targets for cars, vans and heavy-duty vehicles, which will eventually speed up the sale of EV. Let me point out as well the rise of low-emission zones, which are being developed all around European cities. This is a strong incentive for the deployment of electric cars, but they are facing fierce resistance in many member states and amongst some EU political parties. A good example is the current negotiation on the revision of the Cross-Border Enforcement Directive, which aims to broaden the scope of the infringements that can be taken into account for the exchange of information between member states. The Council added the low-emission zone to the list of infringements, but the first trilogue failed last month because of the strong opposition from the European Parliament and from the Commission. At national level, if I may say, we need to do the job and develop a network of charging points as set in the AFIR regulation. We can work on fiscal incentives as well, as we did in Belgium for electric company cars, which will have to be zero emission by 2026. But I would like to conclude by pointing out that if the electrification of cars is a necessary step for a successful ecological transition, it's certainly not a sufficient one. Let's be realistic indeed. All of this only makes sense if we improve daily mobility. Replacing petrol and diesel vehicles with electric vehicles, ideally equipped with vehicle-to-grid technology, will not solve all traffic jam problems. We need also less individual cars, more car sharing, more public transport, and more active mobility. All of this only makes sense if electricity is zero carbon. We need to boost energy efficiency and develop renewable energies. All of this only makes sense if we reuse our batteries and if we recycle raw materials. We are far from it. We cannot ignore the rising concern about our ability to find the mining resources necessary for this transition. Even without mentioning lithium, cobalt, nickel, or rare earths, let's keep in mind that electric cars need up to 4 times more copper than a conventional car, not to mention the additional needs for the charging points. All of this only makes sense if we make electric vehicles more financially accessible. Most of our citizens cannot afford today's electric cars, as rightly highlighted in your report. EVs are 27% more expensive in Europe and 43% more expensive in the US than their ICE equivalents. In Europe, cars get bigger and bigger every year, as the SUV model is the most profitable. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with a plea to the European and American industry. It's time to change the range of vehicles offered to consumers. Electric vehicles must be light and efficient if we want them to be really sustainable. This is not the case with a 2.5 tons electric SUV. As stated in your joint Euro-Electric EY study, we need cheaper and more affordable vehicles that provide equal or improved performance if we want our citizens to buy or use them. A business-as-usual scenario where huge electric cars replace the whole European fleet of diesel and petrol cars will not help the EU to reach its climate, industrial, and social goals. I wish you interesting and fruitful debates today.